Story. Millionaire husband texted, "Don't wait up. I'm working late." Pregnant wife replied, "Tell her I said hi. Hello, everyone." Charlotte thought the danger was the woman having dinner with her husband. She was wrong. The deeper secret had been hiding inside the story he told about his success for years. Stay with Charlotte, because one late-night text will lead from a nursery to a buried company history, and to a choice no millionaire can make for his wife. If you enjoy stories about family, legacy, and second chances earned slowly, subscribe to Millionaire Stories and stay to the end. Disclaimer: the following narrative is fictional entertainment. The people, businesses, transactions, conversations, and corporate events are invented, and any resemblance to actual individuals or organizations is coincidental. Charlotte Whitaker was 6 months pregnant when she began to suspect that her husband's past was not as finished as he claimed. She was 35, a former nonprofit development director, and the kind of person who remembered birthdays without a calendar. Alexander Hawthorne, her husband of 9 years, was 46, a millionaire founder, and the head of Hawthorne Global, a privately held logistics company with operations in 12 states. People like to call him self-made. Alexander rarely corrected them. Their home outside Boston had been photographed once for a business magazine. The article called it a modern family retreat. Charlotte had laughed when she read that. The house did not feel like a retreat when the dishwasher leaked or Alexander left socks beside the laundry basket. It felt like home. That Tuesday, she had made vegetable soup because Alexander had complained of a cold. At 7:42 p.m., his bowl sat untouched. Her phone buzzed. "Don't wait up. I'm working late." Charlotte almost replied with a heart. Then the tablet mounted beside the kitchen calendar flashed with a synced appointment. Dinner, North Star. Alexander/Victoria S. The event disappeared when the calendar refreshed. Charlotte stared at the blank screen. Victoria Sinclair. She knew exactly who Victoria was. Years before Charlotte met Alexander, he and Victoria had dated. Alexander said it had ended badly and permanently. She wanted a different life, he once said. We were better as a lesson than as a couple. He had never mentioned doing business with her. Charlotte opened his message. "Don't wait up. I'm working late." Then she typed, "Tell her I said hi." Alexander called before she could put the phone down. "Charlotte, what? What does that mean?" She looked at the soup. "It means tell Victoria I said hello." Silence. Then, "It's a work dinner. I thought you were working late." "I am. At dinner. With a consultant. Who used to be your girlfriend." Alexander exhaled. "Can we not do this over the phone? You started it over the phone." "Charlotte." She waited. "I should have mentioned she was advising on something." "Yes. It's not what you think." "That depends on what I think." Another silence. Then Alexander said the sentence that changed the tone completely. "Victoria helped me before Hawthorne was Hawthorne." Charlotte sat down. "What does that mean?" "I'll explain when I get home." He did not return until almost 11. Charlotte was in the nursery, assembling a shelf. Alexander stood in the doorway. "You shouldn't be lifting that. It weighs 8 pounds. I can finish it. I can finish my shelf." He recognized the boundary and stayed where he was. "Victoria is working with North Star Strategy," he said. "North Star is advising us on the regional expansion." "How long?" "About a year." "How long have you been meeting her?" "Off and on for months." "And you never thought to tell me?" "I knew her name would bother you." Charlotte set down the screwdriver. "Her name is bothering me less than your decision to hide it." "It was business." "Then why hide business?" Alexander rubbed the back of his neck. "Because Victoria and I have history." "Yes, I know the romantic part. That isn't the only history." Charlotte waited. Alexander looked toward the window. She was there at the beginning. "Beginning of what?" "Hawthorne." Charlotte frowned. "You told me you started the company with 2 drivers and a rented office." "I did." "Where was Victoria?" "She helped with contracts, introductions, early financing." Charlotte stared at him. In 9 years, she had heard Alexander tell the founding story hundreds of times. At dinners, on podcasts, at charity events, at their own table. Victoria's name had never appeared. "Why did you erase her?" "I didn't erase her. You just told the story without her until even your wife didn't know she existed in it." Alexander's face hardened. It was complicated. Charlotte almost laughed. Again, the favorite word of people who wanted the truth to wait. The next morning, she searched public archives. Not his email, not his phone, old newspapers, business journal databases, state filings. Archived photographs. There she was. Victoria Sinclair standing beside Alexander in front of a warehouse with a crooked Hawthorne logistics banner. Another photograph showed them at a small business award ceremony. A third caption described Victoria as strategy lead and early advisor. Charlotte felt embarrassed by how little she knew, then embarrassed for feeling embarrassed. Alexander had controlled the story. That was not her failure. The discovery also forced Charlotte to revisit the story of her own marriage. She had met Alexander at 25, standing in the corner of a hospital fundraising reception with a clipboard and a broken shoe strap. Alexander, then 36 and not yet famous, had offered her a safety pin. He stayed for the auction because she told him leaving early would make the room look empty. A month later, he donated warehouse space for a winter coat drive. A year after that, they married. Charlotte had never fallen in love with the magazine version of Alexander. She had fallen in love with the man who drove a borrowed van through sleet because a shelter had run out of blankets. That was why the erased history mattered. If Alexander could remove Victoria from the story of his company, what else had he simplified? Charlotte began noticing the language in old interviews. I built. I decided. I saw the opportunity. I took the risk. The pronoun was almost always I. Margaret noticed too. One afternoon, while they reviewed public articles at the kitchen table, she tapped a photograph with one finger. Your father used to do this. Charlotte looked up. What? Tell a family story until he became the main character. Charlotte laughed. Her father, dead 6 years, had been a kind man and a terrible storyteller. He always claimed he taught me to drive. He did teach you to drive. I taught you to drive. He sat in the passenger seat once and yelled at a mailbox. Charlotte smiled. Margaret's expression softened. Your father wasn't dishonest. He just liked a version of events that made him useful. Most of us do. The danger comes when the version affects someone else's money, reputation, or choices. Charlotte closed the article. So you think Alexander is like Dad? No. I think the habit is ordinary. The consequences are not. That distinction helped. It kept Charlotte from turning Alexander into a cartoon villain. His behavior was serious precisely because it had grown from something recognizable, pride. The next Sunday, Alexander asked Charlotte to have dinner with his older sister, Rebecca. Rebecca was 53, a high school principal, and the only member of the Hawthorne family who had ever told Alexander to stop talking during his own birthday toast. She arrived with lasagna and no patience for atmosphere. Are we pretending everything is normal? She asked after 5 minutes. Alexander nearly dropped his fork. Charlotte looked at him. You told her. I told her there are business questions. Rebecca snorted. He said, business questions the way people say, weather event, when they mean tornado. Alexander frowned. Rebecca, what? This is private. Then stop inviting me into private dinners. Charlotte hid a smile. Rebecca turned to her. Do you want me to know? Charlotte considered the question. Not details. Just that I'm not imagining a problem. Rebecca nodded. Good enough. Alexander looked betrayed. His sister ignored him. When Dad died, Rebecca said, Alexander became the one who handled everything. Insurance, lawyers, the company, Mom's house. He was 29. He got very good at solving things before anyone else had to feel them. Charlotte looked at her husband. Rebecca continued. It was useful then. It became his personality. Alexander stared at his plate. I was trying to help. I know, Rebecca said. But helping becomes controlling when no one is allowed to say no. The room was quiet. Charlotte realized older families carried archives too. Not only photographs and contracts. Patterns. The most important part of the evening came later, when Alexander walked Rebecca to her car. Charlotte could hear their voices through the open window. You took her side, Alexander said. Rebecca answered, there are no sides yet. There are facts you did not tell your wife. She doesn't understand the pressure I'm under. Then explain the pressure. Don't replace her answer with the one you prefer. Charlotte stepped away from the window. For the first time, she wondered whether Alexander might actually be capable of change. Not because he looked sorry, because someone he respected was naming the pattern in language he could not dismiss as jealousy. She called her mother. Margaret Whitaker was 64 and retired from a regional bank, where she had spent 30 years in credit risk. Margaret listened quietly. Then she said, Are you worried about an affair or money? Both. Those are different questions. I know. Good. Keep them different until you have facts. That answer was so Margaret that Charlotte smiled despite herself. Her mother came over the next day. Charlotte showed her only records she lawfully possessed: joint tax documents, a household investment statement, and public information about Hawthorne Global. Margaret noticed something Charlotte had missed. A line on the previous year's joint tax summary referenced income from an entity called WBR Holdings. Do you know what this is? No, Margaret pointed to the amount. It may be nothing, but if you don't know, ask. Alexander's office manager had previously sent household tax packages to a shared family folder. Charlotte found the supporting schedule there. WBR Holdings had made a bridge loan to Northstar Strategy. The investment came partly from a jointly titled brokerage account. Charlotte's stomach tightened. Northstar. Victoria. She searched the state registry. Northstar Strategy had 3 owners. One was Victoria Sinclair, through an investment company. 35%. Charlotte sat back. This still did not prove misconduct. It did not prove an affair. But it proved the late dinner was connected to more than nostalgia. Margaret read the documents and closed the folder. Attorney, she said. Charlotte nodded. Caroline Ames was 58, precise, and unimpressed by dramatic conclusions. She practiced business litigation and family law with a partner who handled complex marital finances. At the first meeting, Caroline established rules. Charlotte would preserve documents already in her possession. She would not contact Hawthorne employees for inside information. She would not access Alexander's corporate accounts. She would not accuse Victoria publicly. And she would not assume that because money was jointly titled, every transaction had been unlawful. We need to know what agreements exist, Caroline said. Authority, disclosure, and ownership matter. So does company structure. Facts first. Charlotte liked her immediately. Caroline brought in a forensic accountant named David Cho. David traced the bridge loan through household records and public filings. Northstar had used the money to hire staff before Hawthorne Global's expansion contract began generating revenue. The loan earned interest. On paper, it could be a legitimate investment. Then David identified the question they could not answer from household records. Hawthorne Global had approved Northstar as a major outside vendor. Public records showed Victoria owned more than a third of Northstar, and Charlotte's lawful financial records showed that an entity funded partly from the couple's brokerage account had made Northstar a bridge loan. What Charlotte did not know, and had no right to discover by entering company systems, was what Alexander had disclosed to Hawthorne's board. Caroline did not call the arrangement fraud. She sent Hawthorne Global's outside counsel a narrow, factual letter identifying Victoria's ownership, the family-funded bridge loan, and Alexander's role in the vendor relationship, then asked the company to determine whether its own disclosure rules had been followed. Hawthorne Global was privately held but had outside investors and a written conflict of interest policy requiring senior executives to disclose significant personal or financial relationships that could affect major vendor decisions. After outside counsel compared the letter with internal materials, the lead independent director concluded that the issue warranted review. The board, not Charlotte, would decide whether the policy had been violated. A special committee was formed. Alexander found out 2 days later. He came home before dinner. Did you contact my board? My attorney contacted company counsel. Why? Because our money financed a vendor partly owned by Victoria, and you were involved in selecting that vendor. Alexander stared at her. You have no idea how that deal works. That is why professionals are reviewing it. Northstar saved the expansion. That may be true. It is true. Then the truth should survive a review. Alexander paced across the living room. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid. Charlotte stood slowly. What? Accountability? Drama. She looked at him. You lied about dinner with your former girlfriend, hid that she helped build your company, invested our money in her firm, and failed to tell me she owned part of a major vendor. The drama did not begin when I hired a lawyer. His face tightened. You're pregnant. You don't need this stress. Charlotte almost could not believe he said it. Do not use my pregnancy to make my ignorance sound medically responsible. Alexander stopped. The sentence hit him. Good. The special committee took 3 weeks. During that time, Charlotte kept living. That surprised her. She went to prenatal appointments. She chose a crib mattress. She argued with Margaret about whether babies needed 12 blankets. Life refused to become only one crisis. Alexander moved into the guest room. They were polite, sometimes too polite. One morning, he made coffee and left her mug beside the kettle exactly the way she liked it. Charlotte nearly cried. Love did not disappear on schedule just because trust had been damaged. The committee interviewed Victoria. Her account changed everything. She and Alexander had indeed dated in their 20s. They had also worked side by side during Hawthorne's earliest years. Victoria had introduced Alexander to his first institutional customer. She had helped rewrite a disastrous operating plan. She had negotiated warehouse terms when the company had almost no cash. Then their relationship ended. Victoria wanted to move to New York and pursue strategy work. Alexander wanted to remain in Massachusetts and grow Hawthorne. They separated personally and professionally. Years later, North Star approached Hawthorne about the expansion. Victoria disclosed her ownership to Alexander immediately. She also asked whether Charlotte knew they were working together. Alexander told her yes. That was false. Victoria asked whether Hawthorne's board knew about her ownership. Alexander told her the board had everything it needed. That was incomplete. Most painful of all, Alexander told Victoria that Charlotte had approved the bridge loan because she trusts me on investments. Charlotte had never been asked. When Caroline read that email aloud, Charlotte felt the room go still. He had turned trust into consent. Margaret sat beside her. You all right? No, good answer. Victoria provided emails, contracts, and early photographs. There was no evidence of a physical affair. No secret hotel room. No romantic messages. The dinner that triggered everything had been a business dinner. But Alexander had lied because he wanted to keep two versions of his life separate. To Charlotte, Victoria was ancient romantic history. To Victoria, Charlotte was a fully informed spouse. To the board, Victoria was a consultant whose ownership relationship was less significant than it really was. Alexander remained the only person who knew all three versions. The committee's conclusion was careful. North Star's work was real. Its pricing was within the range of comparable vendors. The expansion had benefited Hawthorne. But Alexander had violated the company's internal conflict policy by failing to provide complete information about his history with Victoria, her ownership interest, and the financial connection through WBR Holdings. The board did not fire him. North Star had delivered real work. The company had not been looted, and the directors concluded that the most responsible response was targeted oversight rather than a theatrical purge. They imposed consequences aimed at the actual governance failure. Alexander lost authority to approve vendors connected to personal relationships. An independent director would oversee North Star. The company hired a compliance officer. The board required written conflict certifications from senior executives. Alexander also agreed to a leadership coach and a formal correction to Hawthorne's corporate history materials. That last part bothered him more than he expected. Before the gala, Charlotte and Victoria met once without Alexander. Not alone. Caroline and Victoria's attorney sat at opposite ends of a small conference table. Charlotte had expected to feel anger the moment Victoria entered. Instead, she noticed that Victoria looked nervous. I know what you probably thought when you saw my name, Victoria said. I thought my husband was lying about being with you. He was. Charlotte appreciated the directness. Were you hoping he would leave me? No, did you still love him? Victoria considered the question instead of rushing to deny it. I loved who we were when we were 28. That is not the same thing as wanting the man he is now. Charlotte almost smiled. That may be the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 3 weeks. Victoria looked down at her hands. I also like that he still valued my judgment. I should be honest about that too. When he said the board knew everything, I accepted it because asking more questions might have made the deal harder. So you benefited from the silence? Yes. The answer removed some of Charlotte's anger and replaced it with something more useful. Clarity. Victoria had not betrayed wedding vows she never made. But she had accepted convenient information. Alexander had done more. He had created the convenience. What happens to North Star now? Charlotte asked. That is for the board and my partners. I will accept independent review. And you and Alexander? Professional contact only, if the company keeps the contract. Charlotte nodded. She did not ask for a promise never to see him again. She was beginning to understand that boundaries enforced by fear were fragile. The real question was whether Alexander could tell the truth even when no one forced him. The annual Hawthorne Foundation Gala was scheduled for the following Saturday. Alexander had planned to announce the next phase of expansion there. The board changed the program. The expansion would still be discussed. But before Alexander spoke, Board Chair Henry Lawson would address the governance review. Charlotte considered staying home. Margaret asked why she wanted to go. The foundation funds the children's hospital, Charlotte said. I helped build that program. Then go for your work, not his image. Charlotte chose a deep blue maternity dress and attended with her mother. She did not walk in on Alexander's arm. She did not carry documents. She did not plan a confrontation. The ballroom was filled with employees, donors, lenders, and families who had supported the company for years. A video began. Charlotte had seen versions of it before. Alexander in the first warehouse. Alexander with the first truck. Alexander signing the first national customer. Then a photograph appeared she had never seen in an official Hawthorne presentation. Alexander and Victoria, both 20-something, standing beside a folding table covered with invoices. The caption read, Early Operations Team, Alexander Hawthorne, Victoria Sinclair. Marcus Reed. The audience applauded. Victoria, seated at a side table, remained still. Alexander looked at the screen. For the first time, his public story included someone he had edited out. Henry Lawson walked onto the stage. At 70, Henry had the deliberate pace of a man who never confused volume with authority. He told the room Hawthorne Global had completed an internal review of vendor disclosure procedures. He did not mention Charlotte's marriage. He did not identify private financial details. He said the board had found deficiencies in conflict disclosure, adopted corrective measures, and strengthened independent oversight. No employee should carry responsibility for decisions that belong to senior leadership, he added. Charlotte noticed several warehouse managers visibly relax. That mattered to her. Accountability did not require harming people who had done nothing wrong. Then Alexander spoke. His prepared remarks were on the teleprompter. He ignored the first paragraph. When I was younger, he said, I believed a founder's job was to be the strongest person in every story. The room quieted. I confused strength with being the person who needed the least help. Over time, I told our history in a way that made other people smaller because I thought it made the company look stronger. Charlotte looked at Victoria. Victoria looked back. Neither smiled. Alexander continued. That was not accurate. Hawthorne was built by many people. Some are still here. Some moved on. Some disagreed with me. Their contribution does not reduce mine. Telling the truth about them does not weaken this company. It was not an apology to Charlotte. It was not enough for the marriage. But it was the first time she saw him surrender control of a story in public. After the gala, Alexander asked to meet privately. Caroline was present. So was Margaret. Victoria joined with her attorney because the discussion included North Star. Alexander looked exhausted. He turned to Victoria first. I should have disclosed everything. Yes, she said. I thought if the work was good, the history didn't matter. The history mattered because you decided alone that no one else needed it. He nodded. Then he looked at Charlotte. I never cheated on you. Charlotte held his gaze. I believe that. Relief crossed his face too quickly. She continued. That does not mean we are fine. The relief disappeared. You told another woman I had approved something I had never seen. You let the board believe her company was more independent than it was. You told me she belonged to the past, while she was helping shape your future. I was afraid you would misunderstand. No, you were afraid I would have an opinion. Alexander looked down. That was the sentence he could not defend. Caroline placed a temporary marital financial agreement on the table. It required notice before extraordinary transfers from jointly titled accounts, full documentation of the WBR investment, and a plan for Alexander to replace the joint accounts participation in the bridge financing with separate funds if Charlotte did not consent to leaving family assets exposed to that investment. His attorney had already reviewed it. Alexander signed. No shouting. No dramatic threat. Just a signature under a truth that could no longer be edited. The months after the gala changed Charlotte in ways she did not expect. She had spent years describing herself as taking a break from nonprofit work while Alexander's company expanded. The break had become 3 years. Pregnancy made returning immediately unrealistic, but it did not stop her from planning. She met with former colleagues. She joined the advisory committee of the Hawthorne Foundation, this time under governance rules that gave her an independent role rather than a ceremonial title. She opened an account in her own name for earnings from future consulting. Not secret money. Her money. Alexander moved to an apartment nearby. They entered counseling with no promise of reconciliation. At one session, the therapist asked him why he had erased Victoria from the company story. Alexander answered slowly. Because she left. Charlotte looked at him. He continued. I was angry that she could help build something and then choose a different life. So I told the story as if I had never needed her. Victoria was not in the room, but Charlotte felt the weight of the confession. And me? She asked. Alexander looked at her. I did something similar in a different way. You stopped working full-time when my travel got worse. You hosted investors. You helped with the foundation. You made our life work. I treated those things as personal instead of as contributions. Charlotte's eyes filled. She had not realized how badly she wanted that acknowledged. Not because it changed property rights. Not because it entitled her to applause. Because invisible work still shaped a life. Their son Samuel was born 6 weeks early on a rainy morning. He was small but healthy. Alexander arrived at the hospital after Margaret. He did not complain. He waited until Charlotte asked him to come in. When he held Samuel, his hands shook. I'm sorry, he whispered. Charlotte did not ask whether the apology was for her, for the baby, or for the years he had spent needing every story to center him. Maybe it was for all of it. For the next year, Charlotte and Alexander remained separated. Hawthorne Global continued to grow. North Star remained a vendor under independent oversight. Victoria sold part of her ownership to outside investors and stayed on as an advisor. She and Charlotte never became friends. They did not need to. Several months after Samuel's birth, Victoria sent Charlotte a handwritten note. I should have confirmed what Alexander told me instead of accepting the version that made the work easier. I am sorry. Charlotte kept the note, not as proof of betrayal, as proof that accountability could exist without hatred. Charlotte returned to nonprofit development consulting part-time. Her first client was a regional hospice network. The work mattered to her. She spent afternoons helping Samuel learn to sit up and evenings rebuilding a professional identity she had allowed to become secondary. Alexander changed too, but the change showed itself in ordinary moments rather than speeches. He still interrupted. He still made decisions too quickly. He still occasionally said, I handled it, and then stopped himself. The difference was that Charlotte no longer let those moments pass. Did you handle it? She would ask. Or did you decide it? Sometimes he apologized. Sometimes they argued. Progress lived in repetition, asking, listening, correcting, and doing the same thing more carefully the next time. Margaret later told Charlotte that the hardest lesson in long marriages was learning that forgiveness could be generous without becoming careless. Charlotte kept that distinction. She did not ask Alexander to prove he was sorry once. She watched whether he could behave differently when apology no longer earned immediate credit. That became her standard for every step that followed. A year and a half after Samuel's birth, Charlotte agreed to a structured trial reconciliation. Alexander did not move home immediately. They continued counseling. They kept separate financial advisors. They agreed that major household investments required discussion, not assumption. Charlotte made clear that reconciliation was not a reward for good behavior. It was a new relationship being tested. One Saturday, they took Samuel to Hawthorne headquarters for the dedication of a small company history exhibit. The first display showed the original warehouse. The second showed early contracts. The third showed photographs of the people who helped build the company. Victoria was there. Marcus Reed was there. Drivers whose names Alexander had forgotten were there. Charlotte was there too, in a photograph from years later, sitting at a folding table during the first Hawthorne Foundation fundraiser with a baby niece asleep on her shoulder. Samuel, too young to understand, slapped his hand against the glass. Alexander laughed. Henry Lawson stood nearby. More accurate? He asked. Alexander looked at Charlotte. Yes. Charlotte corrected him. More complete. He smiled. More complete. 2 years after the text message, Alexander moved home. Not because the company board approved him. Not because Charlotte's mother forgave him. Not because Victoria disappeared. He moved home because Charlotte decided the evidence of change was sufficient for one more attempt. There were rules. No hidden financial arrangements involving friends, former partners, or family. No using "I didn't want to worry you" as a substitute for consent. No rewriting history to avoid discomfort. And one rule Charlotte insisted on more than any other. If the truth might change the other person's decision, that is exactly when the truth must be told. Years later, Samuel asked about the photograph of Victoria in the company exhibit. Who's that? Charlotte looked at Alexander. He answered, She helped me build the company when I was young. Was she your friend? Yes. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. Alexander laughed. She was more than my friend for a while. Long before your mom and I got married. Samuel accepted the answer with the indifference of a child who had expected something more exciting. Then he ran toward a truck display. Charlotte watched him go. Alexander stood beside her. I would have lied about that once. I know. Or left out half of it. I know. He looked at the old photograph. I thought controlling the story made me powerful. Charlotte rested a hand on his arm. It made you lonely. He nodded. The text that began the crisis had sounded like the oldest lie in marriage. Don't wait up. I'm working late. Charlotte's reply had sounded like a challenge. Tell her I said hi. But the woman on the other side of that sentence was not the villain. The real threat to the marriage was Alexander's belief that he could decide which truths each person was entitled to know. Charlotte's victory was not exposing an affair. There was no affair to expose. It was refusing to let jealousy distract her from the deeper pattern. She protected lawful records instead of stealing information. She sought professional advice instead of making public accusations. She allowed the company's board to handle company governance and her own counsel to handle marital finances. Most important, she did not let anyone, not Alexander, not Victoria, not the board, not even her mother, decide whether she had to stay or leave. She chose slowly. Sometimes courage is walking away. Sometimes it is staying after change has been earned. And sometimes it is refusing to decide until the truth is complete. Charlotte eventually stayed. But she stayed as a woman with her own work, her own advisors, her own voice, and a husband who understood that love did not give him editorial control over reality. Samuel inherited wealth. He also inherited something harder to build. A family that had learned to tell the whole story.